Hello and welcome to Penmanship, a podcast about Australian writing culture. I'm your host, Andrew McMillen. My guest in episode 33 is Holly Throsby. As an accomplished singer and songwriter, Holly has been performing since 2004 and has released 5 albums. In 2010, she joined forces with her friends Sarah Blasko and Sally Seltmann to form the indie pop group Seeker, Lover, Keeper, which released 1 album the following year. In 2016, she became an author. Her first novel was published in September by Allen Unwin. It's named Goodwood, and it's about what happens to a small town in New South Wales when 2 prominent members of the community go missing within a week of each other. The story is narrated by a 17-year-old named Jean Brown, and everything we see is filtered through the young narrator as she grapples with the dramatic turn of events. It's a combination of a mystery narrative and a portrait of a town experiencing a collective trauma. Goodwood offers a wonderfully lush and well-realised depiction of several aspects of contemporary Australian life, and it announces Holly as a major talent in fiction writing. I first met Holly in April 2013 when she invited me into her home in Sydney to talk about drug use for my book Talking Smack. In late September 2016, Holly's book was launched in Brisbane by previous Penmanship guest Kathleen Noonan at Avid Reader Bookstore. The morning after, we met at an inner-city hotel room for a conversation which touches on her extensive research into the creative process as she began the book's first draft while pregnant with her daughter. Why she likes the distance and anonymity that comes with writing fiction. How elements of the story and its characters draw on her upbringing in Sydney's inner west. How she snuck some of her favourite Australian expressions into the book's dialogue. What inspired her to record an album for children, and what led her to write an op-ed for the Sydney Morning Herald about same-sex marriage. Introducing Holly Throsby, songwriter, musician and author. Holly Throsby, welcome to Penmanship.
Thank you for having me.
You are a published author.
I know.
How does that feel?
Who would have thunk it? It feels different and exciting and a bit daunting.
How so? What's the difference between, say, an album release and this first 300-plus page book of yours?
I guess, to me, this feels a bit like I did when I released my first album, which was kind of terrified, but very excited, of course, because, completing a big project is always gives a sense of achievement, which is really nice. But yeah, I guess for me this is such a new medium, which I had been for a long time wanting to explore, but I guess it's a very solitary task writing a book, so putting it out there in the world after working on it by myself for so long is definitely involves some trepidation.
How much planning or plotting or outlining did you do before you started writing it? Was it all in your head, or did you kind of do...
No, it wasn't. And before I set off to write it, I decided that I would read a lot about how other authors write, because I wasn't sure how it was done. So I read several sort of essays by authors about their creative process, which I found really interesting. I always find it interesting to know how people work, no matter what their profession. I find vocation interesting.
Me too.
And then there's some great books, like some little books like that Daily Rituals book that just sort of, it's almost like a gift book in presentation, but it's got really interesting kind of information about how all kinds of different people structure their creative day. And I read some very practical kind of how-to books about how to write. And the thing that struck me was how few authors really plot very strongly before they set out. Some do, but a lot of authors do start with the blank page and set off from there and allow the story to sort of develop, maybe with some fragments of ideas, and sort of see where it takes them, which is a lot like songwriting has always been for me. And that made me feel very optimistic, because I didn't know what I wanted to write about, and I wanted to just be able to feel my way, and I was pleased to sort of be given permission in a way to do that from other people's past experience.
What were some of those how-to titles or that kind of book?
The first one I read was Stephen King's book on writing.
Fantastic.
Which was great. It was really great. I've never read a Stephen King novel. I'm almost ashamed to say, but
I'm the same.
I love I love the film Stand By Me, which I know is based on a novella that he wrote called The Body, which I always meant to read but never did. And I've watched several sort of adaptation films of his, but his book about writing I thought was really great. So it was so insightful, and including a really exciting bit at the back where there's pages of, this is the books that I read this year, and I could not believe how much Stephen King reads. His basic advice is to write a lot and read a lot, which seems like a given, but is always good to know. But I think the interesting things that he says are, to write every day, to put stuff in a drawer, to leave it for a while, to look at it again, to review it, to chuck it out or keep going, and, to just throw as much as you can out there and until you find stuff that sticks. And to me, as a musician, that's what all songwriters do. I mean, we're always playing with melodies, always strumming chords and finding different melodic phrases and perhaps a verse here and a chorus there and bringing them together. So it seemed like there were some similarities in those processes.
That Stephen King book is fantastic, and I'd recommend any of our listeners read it. This is a podcast about writing culture, and what I really liked about that one was how he blended his kind of memoir aspects of his young life as a writer on, trying to make a living from doing this very difficult thing of sitting at a desk and writing words, and then getting into the practical advice of what he would tell any person who wants to do that themselves. I think it was a really good merging of those two themes. Was there anything else that stuck out to you about that book in particular?
I guess it is that kind of thing. He would give some sort of examples of, how to write speech, or some very extremely practical things.
Dialogue, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I really liked those. Is it who's the guy that has the 10 rules for writing? 10 rules for how to write good. Elmore Leonard.
Oh, right.
And they're great. They're really great. And a lot of them, you read them and you think, you kind of knew that already, but it's much like, any good book is, or a good song or anything. It's the stuff that you kind of feel like you knew already, but it feels a bit cloudy until you read it on the page and it becomes quite clear. But, and Steinbeck's had a lot of great stuff about character description and how, he said something along the lines of, tell me what a person says and I'll imagine what they look like, rather than going on and telling me everything that they look like. And I think a lot of the time it's nice for readers to sort of, to leave a lot up to readers in terms of description. Like I like to give an indication, but also leave a lot of space for readers to fill in faces or, or places in their own mind. And I think, about Goodwood, when I was writing Goodwood, I felt that I wanted it to be a bit of an every town. So there's a lot of description in there, but it's open, I think, enough for people to think this could have been my town.
Yeah. The town feels very alive on the page. Absolutely. You really captured the sense of place superbly well. Oh,
thanks.
I'm reviewing the book for The Australian. The review is not yet published, but it is a positive review.
Oh, thank God. This is going to be awkward if it wasn't.
I hated it. No, of course not.
No, but there's a lot of great stuff. Carson McCullers wrote a really great essay on creativity. I've always been inspired by Annie Proulx, largely because she was such a late publisher, and I think that's one of the gorgeous things about writing any kind of prose, is that as a musician with the music industry, there's a real cult of youth, and I think it's probably the same if you're an actor, or a lot of art forms really have this sort of prize thing about youth. But writing is such a sort of long game. The process is very long. And you hear these wonderful stories of people who, like Annie Proulx, for example, who wrote a couple of books about how to make cider and worked at a newspaper and had very practical jobs, and then wrote her first fiction, I think, in her 50s. I mean, like, these things really inspired me as someone who had a huge kind of desire to write, but thought, I do have time. Like, I can gather enough stories to wait and then sort of do it when I'm ready. I didn't feel this huge rush to do it all through my 20s. I felt like it was something that was slowly building in me, and I think that must be how a lot of authors feel, because a lot of authors do publish late in life and then go on to have these careers into their 60s and 70s, and I think that's a fantastic thing, because the older and wiser people get and the more stories they've accumulated, it's nice, and the publishing, the book industry seems to foster that, whereas a lot of the times in the music industry, big record labels all just want the next young hot teens, which of course, it's a shame. It doesn't foster as much a really long-term career, I don't think.
Well, just based on what you're saying there, I wonder how much of that is to do with image, because a lot of the music and entertainment industry is about the image of the performer on stage or in the music video or whatever, whereas a book, it exists, it's 300 plus pages of a story. In a sense, it doesn't really matter what the author looks like.
No, I think that's such a great relief and a wonderful thing. I mean, it should always be like that. I mean, I think, yes, performers, yes. Of course, in pop music, there's behind-the-scenes songwriters working all the time, and nobody knows who they are or what they look like necessarily, unless you're in that industry and really find out and look. But yeah, I guess the sort of the vehicles that deliver songs are often, there often is a thing about image involved in that, and I get that, because everyone likes seeing hot people sing songs. I mean, that's fine. And there's always something seductive about that. But I think in terms of the creation, I do really like the kind of distance and anonymity that comes with writing fiction. I think that frees people to be able to express themselves in a purer way. Really understand people who write under pseudonyms. I think that makes perfect sense to me, because I've read the Elena Ferrante books and they're fantastic, but you wonder, they're so revealing, really, of character and this intensive relationship between these two women, that to write like that, I think that would have given her a huge amount of freedom to remain anonymous and do that, and people just adore them.
Did that ever cross your mind to use a pseudonym?
No, it didn't. But I wouldn't dismiss the idea in the future. I mean, I'm not sure, but I wanted this book. I felt comfortable writing under my name, and I probably will. But I think for me, the distance that I was able to achieve was in writing fiction, as opposed to performing a song under my own name, which people often would assume was autobiographical. Like, this is, that gave me a distance in the same way.
Do you find that people are assuming autobiographical elements of Goodwood?
Oh, they might do.
Perhaps it's early days. It is release week after.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, they might do. And of course, there are elements, I think, of my personality in the book, as I'm sure would happen with most authors, especially with your first book. And that doesn't really concern me, though, because who knows which parts they will think reflect me or not. It doesn't really matter to me.
We should say a little about what the book is about. How would you describe it to someone who'd never heard of Goodwood? I
would say that Goodwood is about two people who go missing from a small town in New South Wales, the town of Goodwood. And yeah, first of all, Rosie White, who's sort of the really cool girl in town, goes missing. And a week later, Bart McDonald, who's the local butcher and a very kind of loved member of the community, goes fishing and disappears from his boat. So the story is narrated by Jean Brown, who's 17 when the events take place. So we see everything filtered through Jean and her sort of perspective on the town. And in that way, it is a combination of this sort of mystery narrative in terms of what happened to Rosie and what happened to Bart. But it's also very much a portrait of a town and also Jean's own personal story.
Yeah, and the action happens up front, I suppose. The mystery is laid out within the first few pages or the first chapter.
Yeah, I was interested in in putting that out there and then working kind of backwards from there. In terms of the tension, I think that creates the first of all, the tension of having people missing and unaccounted for, and there being this sort of strong ghostly presence hanging over the town that creates. And secondly, that tension I think that books do when you do find out in the first few pages the thing that has happened, and that is that, you know, you spend your time working backwards to work out why that was.
Why 2 missing people? Why not just one?
Why not?
Yeah, no.
Why not 2?
Absolutely. It's just... there may or may not be a link later in the book. Of course, we won't discuss spoilers.
I guess 2 more than 1, because the book is really interested in relationships and connections between people and place and family, and a lot of them are unexpected or unlikely connections that I think characters that you wouldn't necessarily assume to connect might in this book, and I thought that was interesting, and in a way that is represented by these 2 very, very different people who go missing, and the idea of a connection between those 2 events.
Yeah. The book is set in 1992. Why?
I felt like I always wanted to set the book in, you know, sometime in the past. That was partly to do with the way information spreads these days, which is so modern. I didn't want to be dealing with that. I didn't want to be dealing with the internet and mobile phones, and, you know, there's something to me that, you know, having grown up before that, I feel there was something a little bit more romantic about the way people communicated pre-technology. And I feel like that kind of gives it a sense of innocence. For me, 1992 was a really big year because I was younger than Jean. Jean's 17 in that year. I was 13. But to me, I was looking up, you know, so much to my older sister, who's 5 years older, and all the cool stuff she was into. And, you know, it was a really exciting year for music, and a lot of my tastes were forming in terms of what I was into, and it was a very exciting time for me. So to me, I kind of was interested in those kind of cultural touchstones, some of which are mentioned in Goodwood. And also,
not a whole lot, though.
Not a whole lot, because I didn't want it to be too bogged down with. I mean, I wanted it to be sort of incidental, but enough so that people would recognise that time frame. But also there were some very sort of fascinating real life crimes that took place in New South Wales that sort of all began to unfold in 1992. So I kind of wanted Goodwood to be this sort of every town that was also, you know, that is a fictional town, but I did want to make it very real and set it within a very real Australian kind of historical landscape.
Yeah. No, great job. Like I said, you've done really well. You have quite a few characters, and they all feel quite rich and three-dimensional to me. Was it a challenge for you to keep all of those characters in mind and make sure that they all felt real to you?
It wasn't as much as a challenge as I would expect, that aspect of it. I think because as they arrived to me, they were strangely formed. And I wonder if a lot of authors feel the same way, that they sort of have this inkling of a character and already you have this feeling of their backstory. And a lot of them represent elements of people that I've known in my life. And a lot of them represent characters that I've seen, whether that is in song or film or books or TV. I mean, I think all the characters to me probably had a sort of a germination somewhere, but in my mind they felt so real so quickly that their stories seemed to come out almost attached to them, which was really good. I mean, there was definitely extremely challenging parts of writing the book, but the character stuff wasn't one of them. I felt kind of connected to them, and like their stories sort of unfolded quite quickly as I imagined them, and it was more about knowing which details of their lives to put in, because there are a lot of them, and I feel like I wanted the town to have that three-dimensional quality, but it is about, you know, knowing which elements of their lives to include and which to leave in a kind of more mysterious and open way.
There is a lot of small town gossip in the book. Is that in any way reflective of what you might have experienced yourself in life? Because I thought that was really well portrayed, the way that, kind of like the Bush Telegraph, or the way that the shopkeeper, is it Nance, who knows everyone and everything and can see down either side of the street and know what's coming and going, and she's kind of the font of all information.
Yeah, look, I think that's a pretty common experience for everybody. I mean, it's the same as everybody's social group, you know. And I grew up in Balmain in Sydney, which is a peninsular suburb. It's very gentrified and quite wealthy these days. But when I was growing up there, it still had this sort of overhang of a bohemian, quite an artistic kind of community. But at being a peninsula, it you know, nobody drove through unless you were sort of living in Balmain. It really had a very, very intense feeling of walking. You walked up and down Darling Street, the main street, and you really did know everybody, and you knew all the shopkeepers, and you know, all the parents at school knew all the other kids. And there was, you know, that this is the middle of Sydney, but I don't think that's an unusual thing. But I think the thing about small towns is, as Jean's Nan says, you do have this high density of acquaintanceship, meaning that, yeah, everybody that's there, if there's the fewer people there are, the more people are going to know. And yeah, setting it back in a time when the information was spread in a more word of mouth way, or you know, landline telephones or newspapers that were made of paper, which I still like to read. Yeah. I thought that was a nice way to reflect the different character types through the way that they spread information or kept it to themselves. It says a lot about people, I think, in terms of what they share and what they keep private. Much of the book, as you've already mentioned, is around mystery, the not knowing. It's not until quite late in the book that we do learn what has happened. Is that mystery element, is that something that you enjoy reading yourself in? Yeah, very much. Fiction or non-fiction? Yeah, very much. I've read a handful of true crime books. I often find them a bit scary, but I've read a handful. But yeah, I mean, I'm a big fan of crime and crime mystery as a genre. I first fell in love with that through James Ellroy, who I studied at university. I did a course in I think it was either postmodernism or contemporary American literature, and LA Confidential was on the list, and that was the first crime book I'd read, and this was in my early 20s, and it just blew me away. I thought it was an incredible book, and then I went back and I read, this is the third book in his LA Quartet. I then went back and read the first and the second and then the fourth, and then the trilogy that follows that, which I also consumed. And and it might be interesting because it's, you know, they're racist and misogynistic and violent, and you know, I mean, who knows if this reflects his feelings, or if he's, you know, they're set in the 50s in this culture that obviously was very much that in the police force in Los Angeles. But yeah, I found them just fascinating in terms of the pace and the way that the revelations would just smash you in the face. That was so fantastic. And since then I have a couple of, you know, what I would call crime books are some of my favourites. Some of the Cormac McCarthy books, like No Country for Old Men. I mean, it's a crime book. It's so fantastic. It just reads itself. It's so fine. The pace is so quick. And I really enjoy some of James Lee Burke's books, particularly the Billy Bob Holland books. And yeah, I guess I you know, in terms of authors like Kate Atkinson, I like the Jackson Brodie detective ones. You know, like I do really enjoy a pacey kind of mystery story. But I guess that being said, the books that are kind of really are closest to my heart are not that at all. They'd be more character studies, family stuff that makes me cry, stuff, you know, the really treasured emotional books. So for me, Goodwood is, you know, hopefully combines those two elements. I think it has a strong emotional heart to the story. But the town of Goodwood obviously has these things happen, and I hope that the pages turn, because you do want to know what's happened. Yeah, absolutely. I can confirm they do. So tell me about the first draft. The first draft I wrote when I was pregnant, which was a really recommend that. It's a good time to write a book, mainly because you have such a deadline that's it really is coming. I think I needed to have some kind of deadline in order to write the way that I did. being a songwriter, I was never particularly disciplined, and I would sort of write here and there in big clumps and then leave it for a long time. And, you know, it hadn't been since I was in university that I had been working really disciplined in terms of, you know, completing long essays and things like that. So I was really quite ready to do that kind of work again. I'd started the book as a series of small vignettes, which were based on Jean, the narrator, and in her voice, and slowly finding this central narrative of these missing people. But I had Jean, I had her mum, I had her nan and pop. That was sort of her family was where I kind of started in terms of character.
So she was always a single parent child.
She was a single parent child, and I was interested in exploring some sort of non-traditional family structures and celebrating them, I guess, because I think Jean's mum is a fantastic mother, and she is adopted, and I think her adoptive parents are clearly a really beautiful pair. So I thought it was interesting to have these very strong central female characters that are obviously very intelligent, and I think that's what gives Jean her quite kind of bold individual personality. I think she although she doesn't realise it, I think at this time in her life, I think she is comfortable in her skin, and hopefully that would continue in her life. Mm-hmm. But yeah, I started with these vignettes and then sort of set off writing the first chapter. It all kind of came together quite quickly, and that first chapter is quite similar to what is the first chapter.
Right. Which ends with a fantastic sentence, which I think you can probably remember exactly, but
I can't remember exactly.
It's let me find it. I'm paging through the books. That was the day I found the money. Full stop. It's like, oh, okay. There's another mystery. I want to know what happened there. Yeah.
Yeah, I wanted Jean Jean is involved in the things that happen in Goodwood. She does have a role in what happens in a small way, but at the same time, she mainly is an observer to the events. I definitely felt that from the outset, I knew that she had some minor involvement, but generally she's more on the sidelines, and
watching and then going home and writing in a journal.
Well, yeah, that's what I would have been doing when I was that age. I was doing that. I was writing everything in my journal when I was a teenager, and I still often do. But yeah, I set off on. What's that?
You still journal?
Yeah, I do.
Very good. Handwritten or?
Yeah, definitely. Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely handwritten. Although these days I'm worrying about that because I'm wondering if I'm slightly dyslexic, because every time I write handwritten now, and I think this is because I spent so much time at a laptop, I start muddling my letters around, which has never happened to me before. But when I was writing, I write shopping lists and stuff like that, and I start the letters are all the wrong way around, and I'm like, has spending this much time on a laptop messed with my mind this much, which is a real shame, because I think handwriting is beautiful, and I always like to have a nice pen and a nice notebook.
Yeah.
But yeah, in terms of the first draft, I wrote the whole thing in about 8 to 9 months. And yeah, I wrote very disciplined, every day of 9, like a sort of Monday to Friday. That's just what I did.
Really?
Yeah.
9 to 5, roughly?
In a way, not 9 to 5, more like 10 till 3.
Yeah, right. Because you hit your limit.
Beyond 3, I'd just become it would all be gone. But then by the next morning, I was really ready to start again. And some days I had a lot of trouble. I'd feel lousy for several days in a row and feel like I hadn't gotten anywhere. And then other weeks I just had this incredible week where the story had just advanced to places I didn't expect it was going, and I'd be very excited and sort of really buzzing to get back there and keep going.
What a great feeling to have.
Oh, it's a fantastic feeling. It's something that I hadn't experienced nearly as much in songwriting, because songwriting isn't such a big, expansive, immersive thing. You get this amazing feeling when you've found a great melody and found a great way that it can lead into a chorus, and then finish the song and thought, great, this is a great song. And when I do feel like I've written a good song, I like to keep singing it and playing it. I play it 10 times in a row and feel really excited by that. But the thing I really liked about this is how long that kind of lasted, and how many ups and downs you can feel within one project that's extremely long.
I think Stephen King had a fair bit to say about discipline on writing, how it's just a matter of turning up at the desk every day, and maybe I can't remember if he puts the kind of, must write 1,000 words a day type pressure on himself.
I think he does do something along those lines. But other authors can be so slow. I mean, I've read some authors write, less than 500 words a day. I mean, I think it really just depends on how these things come out. And I don't think there should be any, there's no right or wrong in that. But for me, in writing this, I enjoyed it when it was very fast. And those tend to be the sections that I like best now, and that needed the least work. The ones that I was sort of labouring over, I felt less happy with.
Right, so you finished the first draft before you gave birth?
Yes, and then I had my baby, and then, I'd planned to pick it up in 3 months' time, because I thought that was a good amount of time to leave it, so I could read it again as if it was something I hadn't written, and I tried very hard to forget it, which I really managed because I was a new mum with a baby, and I've totally forgot it. I was in an entirely different universe. But of course 3 months went past, and another 3 months went past, and another 3 months went past, and so 10 months later I opened up the document again, and I went and I printed the whole thing out and read it off the page. I got really good advice on that from Richard Walsh, who's the publisher that I worked with, and who I was showing, but he was the only person that sort of saw Goodwood along the way. But also my friend Peggy Frew, who wrote Hope Farm. She's a musician from Melbourne who, shortlisted for the Miles Franklin. It's a beautiful book that she's written. And they both really stressed to me the importance of printing out your work and reading it from paper. Right. She said she'll be shocked at how... And she also suggested putting it in a different font than I'd written it in on the computer. Wow. She said you'd be so shocked if you put it in a different font and print it and read it back. It'll read totally different. You'll see things that you didn't realise were wrong and things that you didn't realise were right. Huh. And
I've not heard that before. That's fantastic.
Yeah, and Richard had said to me, you have to print it out to read it. And since then I've heard numerous studies about the way we read off screens, and how, there's an article saying that actually making us dumber, because the brain doesn't process that information off screens the same way that it does off a page. And so doing that and reading it, I can't tell you how different that experience was. The pace of it really is so apparent, I think, reading off a page. So doing that, I was very able to see things that I felt were working and not working. And the first draft was in more shape than I thought it would be. It did seem and feel like a book, but it still had a huge amount of work to do, which was the second draft, which I then went back to laptop and then would print out again, read that. So I was always printing and reading from the page. Mm-hmm.
So you didn't show the book, the words, to anyone until it was done?
No one apart from Richard, who was a real mentor for me and really encouraging, and he would just tell me all the time, just keep writing, keep writing, keep writing. He tells me the same thing now because I've started my new book. Lock all the doors, don't, turn the phone off, and keep writing. And I think that's really the best advice anyone can give a writer, I think. But yeah, I didn't show anyone until the third draft was finished, which was very, very close to the second. It had a couple of little things shifted, but that third draft was what my mum read for the first time, for example, and she was the only one that read at that point. And the uncorrected proof that you've got there on the table is the one that my partner and my friends and anyone else read. Wow. Yeah, so that was a really kind of... I was terrified about, I was terrified giving it to my mum. She really liked it and I was really happy. But yeah, having sat with something for so long on your own is... You really hope that the people in your life will appreciate it.
Did you ask your mum or the other people who read the uncorrected proof to give notes, or just said, here it is, and just leave it?
I definitely, my mum, I definitely sort of said to her, and she did a little bit, and nothing major, but there was a couple of things that she was, that she pointed out that was really helpful. And then of course, an editor, we had a copy edit of the book. And yeah, I was really grateful for those things, because I guess the thing about that is what a treat to have someone who's so professional read your book in such a focused way. Like, that's very flattering for someone, like it's like when someone mixes your record, they're listening to every single instrument and
so intimate and personal.
It's sort of like, well, I can't believe, I mean, obviously you pay them, but they're really taking the time. And a lot of every person I've worked with in terms of recording albums it's always about the love of it, the passion of it. And yeah, I mean, I would hope that in most creative industries that's what it's about, regardless of whether you're getting paid or not.
So at what point did you have a book deal?
Only when the third draft was completely finished.
Oh.
Yeah.
So you hadn't approached a publisher until that point?
Well, Richard...
well, how did that relationship begin then with you and Richard? Because he seems quite an important figure.
Yeah, he was. He's a friend of my mum's. He's a really old friend of my mum's. And I actually didn't realise how important he was in the publishing world at all. Like, I didn't really know that, but I've realised since then that he's had such a fascinating life in publishing. But no, he didn't say here's a publishing contract. He said, I'd really encourage you to write this book. I think it'll be a good book. And when it's finished, I'll take it to Allen Unwin, and I'm confident. But that's all he could say. It's not up to him. So I was so stoked. That's such a celebration the night when I actually got a publishing contract, because I'd spent so much time writing this book, and I really, really hoped that it would get published.
You wrote it on spec, essentially, is the phrase in writing or publishing, writing something complete and then shopping it and seeing if someone would buy it. On spec is kind of the risky way to live.
That's how I did my children's album too.
Oh, right.
Yeah, I mean, and that's how I did my first album too. The first album was completely finished. I paid for it all myself, and then I took it to record labels. And Spunk was the label that I just loved. There was another label in Melbourne called Trifecta, which is now not happening anymore, but they had bands like Architecture in Helsinki and Art of Fighting, which is Peggy Fru's old band, actually. So there was these two Australian labels I just adored because all of my favourite stuff was coming out. And I sent it to Spunk, and I remember meeting Aaron, and it was all finished. And same with the children's album, because I didn't know how to do that, but I did it, and I paid for that myself as well. And then Aaron helped me, because he was like, I don't know what to do with the children's album, but ABC Records, that's what they do. So Aaron, we went to ABC, and I had a finished children's album, and they said yes, they'd put it out. So I have done this before in terms of writing it. But I also thought, well,
it's like the leap of faith, but having the confidence in your own abilities, perhaps.
But don't most authors do this? I mean, there's not that many authors that get publishing contracts based on not having written anything. I mean, unless you're really famous and you're already published, I'm sure. But I felt like that's probably what most authors do. I
don't know. I mean, I'm a non-fiction guy, so I'm probably thinking more in that field than novelists.
Yeah, I feel. I mean, maybe with I don't actually. Honestly, I don't. This is all new to me, the book world. But that didn't seem strange to me, because what if they said, write us a book, and then it was crap and they hated it. So that didn't seem strange to me, but I was very pleased when it happened.
Yeah, we'll talk a little about the children's album, since you mentioned it. That was a few years ago. Was it 2011? It was
2010.
It was released, called C.
Yes, called C.
What was the idea there, and how did that come about? You obviously finished it before you had the deal in place, but why did you want to do that?
Well, I felt compelled, much like I felt with writing this book. I wanted to do something different. I had, and I still do, have a goddaughter who was really little at the time, and she had a little brother as well. Driving around in the car listening to Itsy Bitsy Spider in an English accent with a kind of Muzak background was not cutting it for me. I
Your
felt
tastes were offended.
I was like, come on, we could do better than this. And I guess I started writing songs for them. But it was a really important process for me, I think, making that children's album, because I tried something completely different in terms of my own creative process, which was just real stream of consciousness, free association, trying to think like a kid and not put any adult sort of judgment on it. And there's something really freeing about writing kid songs, because they're not for grown-ups. So I felt like there would be this sort of suspension of judgment, like is this good or is this bad? Like if kids like it, it doesn't really matter if it's good or bad. I mean, I think that the whole thing is to connect with children, and I think kids' brains are fascinating. They're so creative, and then I think through life that often gets drummed out of kids, and as adults, sometimes potentially you'd look at your childhood drawings and go, wow, look at what I was doing then. now I never pick up a paintbrush.
Yeah. Now I've got bills to pay.
Yeah, and it's a shame. And I really wanted to sort of just explore that entirely innocent world where you just don't know anything and everything feels this sense of wonderment is so strong about the world, and because you've never seen a plane. I've never seen a plane. I've never seen it. And I see my daughter now when a plane goes overhead. It's just like, oh my God, she has to run and get us. It's so exciting. And it, I wanted to sort of suspend myself back in that time when everything felt really, really amazing and new. And then in the production of that record, with all the sound effects and all the kids' voices, we did a lot of road testing. Kids loved hearing their own voices. So I would take, like your recorder you've got, but nothing this fancy, to like a kid's birthday party or primary schools, and get lots of voices and sort of weave them all into the songs. And
would you give them direction? Would you say?
Sometimes, sometimes, but the random stuff's always better.
Yeah.
Have you ever seen that? I guess you don't have kids, do you?
No.
There's this show on ABC called Small Potatoes, and it's so funny. It's on ABC Kids, and every episode goes for about 3 minutes or something, and it's animated these potatoes. There's this little like kind of weird naive potatoes with eyes like mouths, and they're always doing like a different theme, and all it is you can tell that they've gone to a school or whatever and said, what do you think people should give up, or should you not give up? And then they've asked kids this question, and then they just have the potatoes with the voice of these children saying these clearly unscripted responses, and it's so good. It's not, every time it comes on I'm glued to the screen and these kids are saying, I don't think you should give up because it's really important to keep trying. Things like that are just so, like the innocence of it, I sort of get a little tear. And so I feel like when I made the kids album, I was trying to get to that sort of space. And then in writing Goodwood, I think that idea of free association and just going where your story is going and letting these characters unfold really quickly was a similar process that I did when I was writing kid songs, which was really fun. And I feel like I hope to apply that again to my next book.
Does your daughter see the children's album?
Yeah, I don't really feel that super comfortable playing my own music in the house, but my partner plays it to her. But at the moment she just really likes the new Warpaint single, and we can't play her anything else. She just wants to hear Warpaint all the time.
It was a great song. New song?
New song, yeah. She just dances and dances and dances to Warpaint. So she's not even 2 yet, so I kind of know the drummer at Warpaint, and I told her that on Facebook the other day. I was like, my kid just won't stop listening to your song. But I think apparently she has also danced to my music, but I feel a bit strange about that.
Well, it was written for children, and now you have a child, so I'm kind of, I get that you feel a bit weird about your own music being played in your house, but it would be lovely if your daughter became a fan of that album. Yeah,
it would be nice. And I just wrote my first new children's song the other day, which I'm really excited about, and I was hoping that heaps more would sort of come out with it, but they didn't because I'm kind of busy with other things. But I do plan on making another children's album one day.
Very good. And you have another album on the way, I believe.
Yes.
Adult album.
An adult album with adult themes. We're just mixing my new album at the moment. Mixing's the part that I just absolutely hate.
Why?
Because I always fall in love with the rough mixes, and I just like them the way they are, and I know they sound a bit shit, but I just like that. And there's something about sort of perfecting it that I'm always really resistant to. And it's painstaking. And I mean, the fun part is when you're laying down new tracks and, someone comes up with a great guitar part, or I'm like, this could be a new harmony. And that bit when the song is just building and building and coming alive, and that's the fun part. But the mixing, I don't like it. So that's where we're at now. Hopefully it won't take too long. But I had a huge amount of fun making this album, and we have some amazing people playing on it. It was a real honour for me, some of those musicians. So and we'll have a first single in November, and then the album in February.
You mentioned last night there's a lot of electric guitar, is that right?
Yeah, I played a lot of electric guitar, and I also have Mick Turner from Dirty Three playing electric guitar.
Wow.
He's probably my favourite guitarist in the world, and hearing him on my songs has just been a real dream for me.
What made you start writing with an electric guitar then? Because that is something you've not done publicly, at least in much of your
not
work.
publicly, but that's also because I'm so lazy. I don't want to have to travel with 2 guitars, and, and how am I going to get an amplifier? We're always running around borrowing people's equipment.
Mm-hmm.
I just was ready to do something different. You definitely get a different kind of feel with electric guitar, and there's something quite free about this record. It's a lot more live. We recorded a lot of the songs live, and it's quite a bold sounding album, I think. A little less sort of fragile in parts, but yeah, I don't know. I was ready for that.
Wow, I really want to hear it. Tell me a bit more about Mick Turner. For listeners who don't know, he is a guitarist in Dirty Three, which is an Australian instrumental trio, violin, guitar, drums, and they are just one of the best bands in the world as far as I'm concerned.
Yes, as far as I'm concerned too.
What is it about his playing that really appeals to you and moves you?
I think it's this same thing that I'm talking about with writing Goodwood. It's just an instinctive performer. I mean, I know that, I'm sure he's had guitar lessons, but he's just had this characteristic sound that is really kind of impressionistic, and it's really about his guitar and his amp and his sound, and then somehow melding himself with the song, as opposed to kind of having a lead line. It's very textural, and to me, as soon as I kind of start hearing that sort of swell up, I don't know, I find it extremely emotional. And I think anyone who's seen Dirty Three perform, it's just the most incredible band. And I've had the pleasure of working with Jim White before. He's a drummer. He was the drummer in Seek, Love, a Keeper.
Of course, yeah.
And Mick Turner is married to... Actually, I don't know if they're married, but he's partnered and has 3 children with Peggy Frew, the novelist.
Oh, wow. There's a few connections going on.
Yeah, so there was a few connections. I actually saw the 2 of them at Sydney Writers Festival, Peggy and Mick, talking about their creative domestic environment. It's fascinating. I think creative couples are really interesting. I've got a really good book about that, from everyone from Frida Kahlo and Diego Rivera, and all these sort of artistic couples that live together and have to have a domestic life as well. It would be a challenge, I think.
Was this always the path for you? You're living a life of creativity. First music, now this book, and there's more books on the way, perhaps. Was there ever any alternative? Did you have...
Nah.
Yeah, it doesn't seem that way.
I don't think so. Although sometimes... I mean, I worked in a video store for 8 years in Balmain, which was like a specialist video store. It was a family-run, husband and wife, and we had sort of directors' sections. It was very small, and it was very sort of specialised with a lot of rare films and stuff. Sadly, that's not really a thing anymore, because there's not really much thing as a rare film anymore, because everybody seems to be able to order them from overseas or just stream them on the internet. But back then, people would come from, they'd drive for hours to have to get a John Waters film or a Jean Cocteau film, and so that was really exciting to work there. I really loved that, and it informed me a lot in terms of storytelling. I watched a lot of films, and it was definitely a real learning experience. And I kind of missed that job, but I always wanted to do creative work.
And you have, and you are. And you're...
Well, so are you.
Yeah, it's great, isn't it?
It's great. No, we're very lucky.
I can't imagine going to an office job, 9 to 5, sort of.
Well, it depends what you're doing in the office, I guess. True. Because I wrote this in that kind of way. I mean, I was in my front room, but now I've rented a studio space, which I call my office, and I love going there. I think it just depends on if you like the work you're doing in the office. Mm-hmm. You could be working in a pasture and it could still be shit work,
Very true, very true. You also worked in a bookshop, you mentioned, at the launch last night.
That was when I was 17. It was barely a year, and I was very intimidated, as I was saying at the launch last night.
Jean's age? 17.
Yeah, I was 17. I was Jean's age.
Was it in Balmain also?
It was, and it was a very classy bookshop too. Uh-huh. It was similar to, an Avid Reader or a Riverbend. It had that. It was a really great independent bookshop, and I felt very out of my depth. I wanted to be good at it, but I just hadn't read enough. I was so young. But yeah, it's something. If I had a retail job, I would love to work at a bookshop. I think just being around all those books all the time, I'd find it fascinating. But then customers would come in and I'd have to stop reading, and that would be annoying. But apart from that, I think I'd love it.
Yeah. 8 years at a video shop.
Yeah, I started when I was 18, and then 26, was that? Something like that. Yeah. It was when my second album, I was making my second album.
What? So it wasn't a chain. What was it called?
It was called The Video Shift. And it's not there anymore because they don't exist anymore, which is really sad. But yeah, it was a great job.
What other jobs have you had? Because you've video shop, bookshop,
I had a job,
musician, author,
programming music for airlines, which went for a while. I did that that's when I was saving up to make my first album. I was working 6 days a week. I was at the video shop, and I had this other job programming music for airlines. There's a company in Sydney who does a bunch of airlines, and I had 7. That was really cool. Really weird. I did like Royal Brunei and these kind of little Vanuatu and stuff like that. I had these I did a lot of programming of sort of interesting religious music that was very badly recorded and comedy stations and all the different music stations, and Qantas. I did Qantas as well, which was really fun. There was a time there where we had a whole channel that was based on soundtrack music, so I would theme so I'd have like 4 songs that were in like 4 David Lynch movies or something like that, and put them all in a row, and then the person who would write the script and MC the show would love it. He'd always email, "This is great," because he could be able to talk about films in this interesting way. We kind of link them and theme them, which was good. I like linking and theming everything. I think that's something that I've always been interested in, collecting things and yeah. I mean, in Goodwood, it has a lot of different characters have. There's a lot of repetition, I think, in Goodwood, which I really wanted. I wanted people to sort of locate certain phrases or words. Of an evening, or
that kind of
Of an evening.
Do you know what I'm talking about?
Yeah, it's a very country expression. It's a very country expression.
It's even the first few pages that I read. I'm like, wow, I've not really heard that phrase in quite a while.
Well, I think if you live in the city, you don't hear that phrase as much, except for older people. But as soon as you go to the country, everyone says, of a Saturday, I do this. I love Australiana. I love Australian expressions, and someone said that they were dead set keen to read my book the other day in a text message, and I said, dead set keen. It's a good expression. No, there's a lot of, I feel like, that's a beautiful thing about, to me, living out of the very small inner city literary kind of area where everyone's very well read and well educated and speaks very well. I love spending time in more regional areas where it's almost like a dialect, and it's fantastic. I think that language is so alive to me and so expressive, and that's why I kind of wanted to include an Irish character, because I've always been a massive fan of Smithy, who runs the Wicco, which is the bar. He is an Irish. He has a sort of faint Irish accent, and I loved writing some of his dialogue, because some of those expressions, Irish expressions, are so lyrical and weird, and like where did that come from? So yeah, and I think the Australian kind of vernacular is just this rich gold mine of expressions.
I just remember Jean's best friend, George or Georgina, has this condition where sunlight makes her sneeze.
Yeah, she has photic sneeze reflex, sun sneezing, as it's called colloquially.
I hadn't heard of that until I read it in Goodwood.
Yeah, well,
where did that come
it's
from?
a thing, you can Google that.
Yeah.
The weirdest thing has happened is that my daughter has it.
Oh.
And I didn't know. I mean, obviously she wasn't born when I wrote that.
Wow.
But every time we go out in the morning, I'll put her in a little pram, and then we'll turn and I'll flip the lid back, and the sun goes in her face and she sneezes. And I'm like, wow, this is the weirdest thing ever. But I found out that the donor that we used to conceive her, who's a really good friend, has it. So wow. I'm not sure if I must have known that subconsciously, but it's thought to be a hereditary condition, but it can be a problem when you're getting things like dental work, because you don't want to be, they give you those big glasses, but the shady glasses, but the lights are so bright, I think it can cause a problem with medical procedures, because you just don't want to be sneezing at that point,
because it's not just sunlight, it's
a bright light. Yeah, it can be any bright light. But George George is a great character. And speaking of Australian expressions, in Goodwood, she says one of my favourite Australian expressions when she says she's fizzing at the bunghole, which is an expression that I learned in Hay, New South Wales, meaning to be very excited. And she says it in a very ironic way, but I had to put that in there.
I was actually going to mention that just before you did, because I remembered that. I actually followed over the page and put a star there because it made me laugh too.
It's a great expression.
Fizzing at the bunghole.
Fizzing at the bunghole. And it's a boat town. It's a fishing lake town. So I thought it was a good expression to use.
So you had this great book, and you already started on another, I believe.
Yes, I have.
How's that going?
It's good. It's so far. I feel I've entered the story, and I feel very attached to my main character already. But I don't want to say too much because I'm not sure how it's going to pan out. But at the moment, it's set in Cedar Valley, which is a town south of Goodwood. It's mentioned a handful of times in Goodwood, and I think I was still very much wanting to continue to explore this locale and this time frame. So it's set a year later in 1993, and an entirely different story, but potential crossover for Goodwood. I really love that thing of fictional worlds crossing over with one another, whether that be in television or film, or just as that sort of self-reflexive thing that happens. I just started reading that book I was telling you about this morning, called Our Souls at Night, and I googled the author, and all of his books are set in the fictional town of Holt, Colorado, apparently. And I love that. I love that this author has created, or a Thomas Hardy kind of thing as well, creating a locale and then always revisiting that with different stories,
different angles on the same environment.
Yeah, it makes it incredibly real, and I think that kind of feeling of interconnectedness is something I've always been interested in.
Have you done much non-fiction writing, or memoir style? Or?
No, not memoir style, absolutely not. Except for I write journals for my own personal
not for public
use.
Consumption.
No. I did an op-ed piece for the Sydney Morning Herald about same-sex marriage several years ago, and I've written a couple of things here and there, but I'm not really interested in memoir. I'm definitely really enjoying fictional world. I feel like that there can be so much. I think readers love authenticity in fiction, and I'm a fan of. I'm not so into fantasy and science fiction. It's just not really my. I'm not hugely a fan of that kind of thing. I really do appreciate realism in fiction, and I'm really enjoying exploring that in that form.
What prompted you to write that op-ed in 2013 for the Sydney Morning Herald?
Because I care about it, and at the time, I mean, it feels like marriage equality has been the big issue for so many years, but at the time it was a big issue, and there was stuff happening internationally, and it was a sort of timely moment, although now every day is a timely moment. But I felt like I was really ready to speak out on that issue. I think it's a very basic kind of equal rights issue, and it saddens me that we haven't caught up with a lot of other countries in the world. Yeah.
No, I read it at the time it was published, and I reread it again yesterday, and it's one of the most succinct and I think inarguable pieces of writing on why we should just get the fuck on with it and make it happen.
Oh, thanks. I hope so. I mean, I think the thing that strikes me about the whole debate is I can't find convincing arguments against it. I mean, I know there's a religious argument against it for a lot of people, but there's also, if we take many other quotes in the Bible, none of them are taken literally anymore, and if they were, we'd be living in this really weird society. And the quotes about homosexuality in the Bible have certainly been interpreted in various ways, and there's a lot of Christians that are absolutely fine with it, or homosexual themselves, and that's fine. So I find the religious aspect. And plus, we do have a nice church-state separation in this country. Like, I don't feel like our other laws are kind of based on the Bible, and I'm not really so sure why people would be so nervous about it. The sort of the children thing I find strange. A lot of heterosexual couples don't have children, choose not to have children, can't have children for medical reasons. And I find that, there's so many arguments you hear against it, but none of them are very compelling to me. The arguments for it, though, I think are very difficult to dismiss.
Yeah, you wrote it 3 years ago, and nothing much has changed, and it's quite frustrating for me as like a casual bystander just to think about how much airtime has been consumed by the humming and hawing and back and like what if we had just made the decision years ago, what else could be filling that vacuum of public discussion rather than this seemingly pointless discussion about something that is going to happen, eventually. History is bending towards this equality.
I mean, if I would hope that people would be thinking more about our Indigenous community, and I would hope people would be thinking more about asylum seeker detention centres. I mean, I find there's so much very, very, very difficult stuff that seems really easy for people to close their eyes to. And I think when I was writing Goodwood, I felt like I wanted to shine a light on things that people don't necessarily talk about so much that are just everywhere. Concepts, the idea of domestic violence, which is, since I wrote this, I watched that Sarah Ferguson documentary, Hitting Home, which I just found absolutely devastating, and I think she's a fantastic journalist, and I think, clearly that's very much a topical issue now, but I mean, how old is that issue? It's such a shame when things take so long for people to actually begin to care about, and, the whole thing about everyone needs to see a particular photograph of a child to suddenly care about a group of people. Yeah, that, people forget about our common humanity, but in Goodwood, people are very traumatised and flawed, and those things aren't, I don't make them, they're not jumping off the page in this really obvious way, but in a subtle way, a lot of people are carrying around a lot of grief and sadness. Yeah. There's a lot of mental illness.
Untreated mental illness.
Yeah, untreated and undiagnosed mental illness, which I think happens all the time within all sorts of communities. I mean, with everybody. And, alcoholism and addiction and violence as a legitimate way of solving problems, which is something that still exists in, so many areas of life. So that I really wanted Goodwood to feel, that it's, in a lot of ways, this book to me is a comedy. It's like this very low-key comedy, but Jean's voice is, I think, very funny. I hope. I mean, I wanted it to be, and it's probably my take on a sense of humour, which not everybody would find funny, but the subject matter is at the same time very dark, and I wanted that lightness of touch to enable those issues to sort of to be apparent to people without sort of weighing them down too much.
All right, coming towards the end, you're very well read. What do you read on a regular basis? What's your reading diet like?
I'd read fiction mainly. Although I do really enjoy non-fiction as well. If I'm reading non-fiction, I really like sort of psychology books in general.
Like pop psychology or like psychology textbooks?
No, more like pop psychology. I just enjoy
like Malcolm Gladwell type things?
I've never read him, but I like kind of, I like pop psychology stuff.
Cool.
Which is, stuff that sort of combines memoir with a sort of further, examination of how the brain works, personality types, disorders of all kinds, personality disorders and illness and things like that. But I generally like, and I also read quite a lot of political books, non-fiction politics stuff, and again, the popular titles that you see at the front of the bookshop, because I enjoy politics. But yeah, mainly I read fiction, and I try to read Australian fiction, and I love a lot of contemporary American fiction. It's probably a lot of my favourite authors, sort of 20th century American authors, but that just sort of goes with the kind of language I'm drawn to. There's a very particular style of those authors, but yeah, I certainly am always reading something.
Can you read the newspaper?
Yeah,
every
I
morning?
subscribe to the Sydney Morning Herald, and it plonks on my front step, and then my dog brings it in, which is adorable. I open the door and then she gets it and brings it in, does a little cry and wags a tail and puts her ears back, and that's good, and I unwrap it. And over the years it's just gotten smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller till now that I remember when the Herald used to come, it was this big fat thing, and now it's this tiny little thin and there's mistakes all through it because there's no sub-editors left, and it's really bad. But I still really like to read, a printed newspaper, and I like to do the crossword, so with a pen. I don't want to do it on the internet, on the computer.
Doesn't David Astle do the Sydney Morning Herald?
He does Fridays, and he's impossible, and I love him for that.
He's a previous guest of Penmanship. So.
Oh, right. No, I really like David. I've met him several times,
Yeah.
and I think he's a great, fascinating
brilliant
person. I actually wanted to text him and ask him about a word the other day, but I couldn't describe what I was trying to say.
Oh.
You know that thing when you're walking down the street and someone's walking towards you, and you both try to avoid each other, so you both go either way, and you get locked into this dance of going the same way, left and right, and then you kind of look at each other and laugh and go, oh God, and then sort of keep walking. There should be a word for that. There should be a sort of verb for that. And I'm sure if there is, David Astle will know. And I was trying to, when I said text, I didn't mean that, I meant tweet.
Yeah.
But I couldn't explain that thing in 140 characters, and I haven't worked out how to do that yet. So if you could think of how we could describe that, I want to know what the verb would be.
All right.
Because I got locked in the other day with this guy. It was a really bad one. Like we were walking towards each other, and it happened. It sometimes happens from meters away,
yeah.
and when it happens, it's happening. You're like, oh no!
Like
and he was walking towards me, and I went left, and he obviously went to his right, and then up the other way, and the other way, and the other way, and we were locked in for so long, and then we both just went oh, and then laughed, and then kind of avoided each other. But I almost felt like we should just sit down and have a beer because we're
basically friends now.
We've gone through this experience together. I also read this interesting thing the other day about birds. They did this study about budgerigars because in terms of aviation safety, they were doing these experiments where they got a tunnel and they put a budgerigar on each end of the tunnel and then flew them towards each other, and they never collided because both birds went right.
Oh.
Every time. They did 102 tests, and every single time both birds went right. And apparently they think that over time birds have developed this thing that everybody knows to go right so nobody crashes into each other in the sky. Why don't humans know that yet? Why do we do the dance? Wow. Anyway, they're going to apply it to aviation safety, and hopefully we don't have to worry so much.
Hopefully. Thanks for talking to me, Holly.
It's been a pleasure.
Thanks for listening to Penmanship, and thank you to my guest, Holly Throsby. You can find show notes to this episode at penmanshippodcast.com. If you enjoy this podcast, there are several ways you can support it. You can share it with people in your life who love talking about and reading great Australian writing. You can leave a review on iTunes or Google Play or wherever you happen to be listening to this podcast. If you have feedback, I would love to hear from you. You can email me, andrew@penmanshippodcast.com. You can find the show on Twitter @penmanshipau and on Facebook. The theme song is Eternally Yours by Laughing Clowns. That's it for now. Until next time.